The moment didn't begin with shouting or spectacle. It began with a pause so heavy it felt intentional, as if everyone in the room sensed that something unscripted was about to happen. At 67, Marvin Winans stood on stage not as a performer, not as a polished speaker, but as a man carrying decades of history, family loyalty, unspoken tension, and spiritual responsibility. Across from him stood CeCe Winans, one of the most respected voices in gospel music, someone the audience adored not just for her talent, but for the grace she seemed to embody effortlessly. What followed was not the confrontation people expected, but it was far more powerful than anything rehearsed. For years, fans had speculated about distance within the Winans family, quietly analyzing interviews, performances, and absences, trying to read between lines that were never meant to be read publicly. The Winans name has always represented unity, faith, and musical excellence, but like many families bound by legacy, what was celebrated outwardly did not always reflect what was carried privately. That night, when Marvin finally chose to confront CeCe live on stage, it wasn't about accusation. It was about acknowledgement, and that distinction changed everything. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't point fingers. Instead, he spoke with the kind of calm that only comes from long internal wrestling. He addressed the weight of expectation that comes with being part of a family whose faith and talent shaped an entire genre. He spoke about how silence can sometimes masquerade as peace, even when it's really avoidance. The audience, initially unsure of what they were witnessing, slowly realized this was not a performance moment. It was a human one. Marvin spoke about years of carrying conversations privately, of choosing restraint over honesty because honesty felt too dangerous when so many people were watching. He acknowledged that the gospel world often assumes that shared faith guarantees shared understanding, but that assumption leaves no room for human complexity. His words landed not as criticism of CeCe, but as an invitation to truth. He spoke about how family dynamics change when legacy becomes public property. Every disagreement feels amplified. Every misunderstanding feels permanent. And sometimes, the pressure to protect an image becomes heavier than the desire to heal a relationship. What made the confrontation so striking was the absence of bitterness. Marvin did not sound resentful. He sounded tired. Tired of pretending that proximity on stage always meant closeness off it. Tired of watching narratives form without context. Tired of carrying emotions that never found language because the platform demanded perfection. He admitted that confronting CeCe publicly was not his preference, but it had become necessary because private silence had begun to distort the truth. He emphasized that this was not about winning a point or settling a score. It was about clearing space for honesty before time made it impossible. CeCe's reaction was equally telling. She did not interrupt, she did not retreat, she listened, and in that listening the room shifted. The audience could feel the tension easing, not because everything was resolved, but because something real was finally being said. Marvin spoke about how gospel families are often expected to model unity at all times, even when unity requires hard conversations that don't fit neatly into worship moments. He challenged the idea that confrontation is unspiritual, arguing instead that avoidance can sometimes be the greater harm. His words resonated deeply because they reflected experiences many families recognize but rarely articulate, especially families navigating faith, public expectation, and generational legacy all at once. He acknowledged his own failures as well, moments when pride and fear kept him silent longer than necessary. That admission disarmed the room. This was not a man standing above the situation. It was a man standing inside it. He spoke about how unresolved tension does not disappear with time. It settles. It shapes interactions. It creates distance even in shared spaces. And when that distance is never named, it becomes easier for others to define the story for you. Marvin made it clear that confronting CeCe was not an act of division, but an act of preservation. Preservation of truth. Preservation of relationship. Preservation of a legacy that deserved honesty more than illusion. As he finished speaking, the silence returned, but this time it felt different. It wasn't anticipation. It was reflection. People were not waiting for drama. They were absorbing vulnerability. In that moment, the confrontation became something else entirely. Not a clash between siblings, but a reminder that faith does not exempt anyone from difficult conversations, and that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do, especially at 67, is to speak openly while there is still time to be heard. As the weight of Marvin's words lingered, what unfolded next was less about resolution and more about recognition. Recognition that the moment on stage was never meant to settle every private detail, but to interrupt a narrative that had been quietly forming for years without consent. Marvin spoke about how public perception can slowly rewrite private relationships, especially when silence is mistaken for agreement. He explained that in families like theirs, where music, ministry, and legacy intertwine, silence is often chosen out of love, not fear. Yet love, when paired with avoidance, can still produce distance. He admitted that for a long time he believed shielding family matters from public view was the most faithful option, but he came to realize that prolonged silence doesn't stay neutral. It invites interpretation. And interpretation, when left unchecked, hardens into assumption. That realization, he said, weighed heavily on him. He described moments where he and CeCe shared the same platform but not the same emotional space. Moments that looked unified to the audience but felt incomplete to those living them. He emphasized that gospel stages have a way of compressing human complexity into polished appearances. Audiences see harmony, but they don't see the work required to sustain it. Marvin spoke about how the pressure to represent spiritual maturity often discourages honest expression. You are expected to rise above conflict quickly, to forgive without processing, to reconcile without conversation. Over time, those expectations create a version of unity that looks impressive but feels fragile. He challenged the idea that disagreement automatically signals division. Sometimes, he said, disagreement is the first step toward deeper understanding. What makes it threatening is not the conflict itself, but the fear of how it will be perceived. He reflected on how their family's influence magnified that fear. The Winans name carries history. It carries expectation. And when expectation becomes public property, it leaves little room for vulnerability. Marvin acknowledged that he had contributed to that dynamic by choosing restraint when honesty was needed. He owned that failure openly, not as a confession for sympathy, but as an example of how even well-intentioned silence can create unintended harm. He spoke about how time changes urgency. At 67, he said, priorities shift. Image matters less, legacy matters more. Not legacy defined by applause or accolades, but by integrity. Integrity, he explained, requires alignment between what is sung and what is lived. When those drift apart, something must be corrected. That correction, he said, does not always come gently. Sometimes it comes publicly, not because privacy wasn't valued, but because privacy had already failed to produce healing. He stressed that confronting CeCe on stage was not meant to corner her. It was meant to reclaim agency over a story that had begun to exist without either of them speaking. He wanted the truth to come from those who lived it, not from speculation. He also addressed the audience directly, reminding them that consuming family tension as entertainment has consequences. Every shared clip, every comment, every assumption adds weight to situations that already carry enough. He asked for patience and empathy, not because the family was fragile, but because real relationships deserve space to breathe outside public judgment. He spoke about how often gospel audiences forget that those on stage are still human, that faith does not eliminate misunderstanding, that worship does not erase emotion. He urged listeners to resist the urge to demand closure from moments that are still unfolding. Healing, he said, is rarely instant, especially when years of silence must first be unpacked. As Marvin finished this portion, the atmosphere on stage felt altered. CeCe remained composed, reflective, present. The exchange had not resolved everything, but it had shifted something fundamental. It had moved the story from rumor to reality, from assumption to acknowledgement. The audience sensed that what mattered was not what would happen next, but what had already happened. A boundary had been crossed, not in anger, but in honesty. And that honesty carried risk. Marvin knew that some would misunderstand his intent. Some would frame it as conflict. Others would choose sides. He accepted that outcome calmly. Truth, he said, does not require unanimous approval to be valid. It requires courage to be spoken. As the moment transitioned, it became clear that this confrontation was not an ending. It was an interruption of silence, an interruption of narratives shaped without consent, an interruption of the idea that faith demands quiet at the expense of clarity. And in that interruption, something rare occurred on a gospel stage. A family chose honesty over optics, not to divide, but to preserve something deeper than harmony, trust. As the moment continued, the emotional weight shifted from the stage to the audience, where many realized they were witnessing something rarely allowed to exist in public faith spaces, unresolved truth being handled without performance. Marvin spoke about how the gospel community often celebrates testimony but avoids process. People are encouraged to share outcomes, not journeys, victory, not vulnerability. Yet real healing, he explained, usually happens in the uncomfortable middle, long before anything feels resolved. That middle is where misunderstandings live, where pride and fear quietly shape behavior, and where silence feels safer than honesty. He admitted that for years he believed keeping things private was the most loving choice, especially in a family watched so closely. But privacy, he learned, can sometimes protect patterns rather than people. He described how unspoken tension does not stay contained. It seeps into tone, timing, and distance. Even when siblings share a stage, something unaddressed can still stand between them. That reality, he said, became harder to ignore as time passed. He spoke about age not as decline, but as clarity. At 67, urgency feels different. There is less desire to manage perception and more desire to align truth with time. He reflected on how many families wait too long to have necessary conversations, assuming there will always be another opportunity. But opportunities narrow with time, and silence, once chosen repeatedly, becomes habit. Breaking that habit requires courage that feels disruptive, even when the intention is peace. He acknowledged that confronting a loved one publicly risks misunderstanding, but avoiding the conversation altogether risks regret. He chose the risk he could live with. He spoke about how faith communities sometimes confuse confrontation with conflict. In reality, he said, avoidance is often more destructive. It allows assumptions to replace communication. It gives outsiders permission to define stories they were never meant to tell. He emphasized that the confrontation was not about correcting CeCe, but about correcting the silence between them. Silence that had begun to speak louder than any conversation they had avoided. He made it clear that love does not always sound gentle. Sometimes it sounds honest. That honesty, he said, is not meant to wound, but to wake people up to what has been ignored too long. He also addressed the pressure placed on gospel families to represent perfection. The expectation that faith should eliminate friction creates unrealistic standards. When those standards are not met, families feel shame rather than support. Marvin argued that this pressure discourages openness and rewards performance. People learn how to appear unified without doing the work of unity. Over time, that gap becomes exhausting. He admitted that carrying that exhaustion quietly had taken a toll, not just on relationships, but on peace. He wanted the audience to understand that the confrontation was not a breakdown. It was a breakthrough moment that came after years of restraint. He spoke about how restraint, while often praised, can sometimes delay necessary growth. Growth, he said, requires friction. It requires willingness to sit in discomfort long enough to understand it. He urged listeners to reconsider how they interpret moments of tension, especially in faith spaces. Not every pause signals division. Not every hard word signals disrespect. Sometimes it signals maturity. He addressed CeCe again briefly, not with accusation, but with respect. He acknowledged her contributions, her grace, her strength. He made it clear that the confrontation was rooted in shared history and shared commitment, not rivalry. That distinction mattered. It reframed the moment from spectacle to conversation. As he spoke, the audience could sense that something deeply personal was being honored rather than exploited. This was not about winning public sympathy. It was about restoring internal alignment. He reminded everyone that families are not healed by applause. They are healed by conversation that is often messy, imperfect, and unsatisfying to outsiders. He asked for patience not just for his family, but for all families navigating complexity under public scrutiny. He emphasized that faith does not remove the need for boundaries, communication, or accountability. It gives them deeper meaning. As the moment drew toward transition, Marvin's voice remained steady. He did not seek closure. He did not declare resolution. He allowed the moment to remain open, unfinished, honest. That openness was what made it powerful. It resisted the urge to package reconciliation for consumption. It respected the reality that healing unfolds over time, not on command. The audience understood that what they had witnessed was not a conclusion, but a beginning of something that had long been delayed. In choosing to speak, Marvin did not claim victory. He claimed responsibility to truth, responsibility to relationship, responsibility to legacy defined not by silence but by integrity. And in that choice, the stage became something rare. Not a place of performance, but a place where honesty was allowed to exist without guarantee of approval. As the evening moved toward its close, the significance of what had happened began to settle more deeply, not as gossip, but as a lesson. Marvin made it clear that the confrontation was never about proving who was right or wrong. It was about refusing to let silence continue doing damage in the background. He spoke about how faith communities often rush toward resolution because unresolved tension makes people uncomfortable. But comfort, he reminded everyone, is not the same as healing. Healing requires patience, honesty, and the willingness to sit with discomfort without demanding immediate relief. He explained that too often public moments are expected to produce tidy endings. Apologies are supposed to be instant. Forgiveness is supposed to be visible. Reconciliation is supposed to be complete before anyone leaves the room. But real relationships rarely follow that script. Real families do not heal on cue. They heal in layers through conversation, reflection, and time. He emphasized that the pressure to perform reconciliation can be just as harmful as avoiding confrontation altogether. When healing is rushed, it becomes shallow. When honesty is postponed, it becomes heavier. He wanted the audience to understand that what they witnessed was not a failure of unity, but a commitment to truth that refused to be staged. He spoke about how the gospel message is often reduced to inspiration, when in reality it is an invitation to transformation. Transformation, he said, always involves disruption. It challenges habits, it exposes patterns, it demands growth. That growth is rarely comfortable, especially when it unfolds in front of others. He acknowledged that allowing the world to see an unfinished moment required humility from both him and CeCe. It meant surrendering control over interpretation. It meant trusting that integrity mattered more than optics. He reminded listeners that faith is not proven by how well people hide conflict, but by how they navigate it. Avoidance may preserve appearances, but it rarely preserves relationships. As he reflected on legacy, his voice softened. Legacy, he explained, is not built by pretending everything is fine. It is built by modeling how to handle things when they are not. Families watching, churches listening, younger generations observing all learn something from moments like this. They learn whether honesty is permitted. They learn whether faith makes room for humanity. They learn whether silence is valued more than truth. Marvin wanted his legacy and his family's legacy to reflect courage rather than convenience. He did not want future conversations shaped by what was never said. He wanted them shaped by the willingness to speak while there was still time. He spoke about how many people regret the conversations they avoided far more than the ones they had. Regret, he said, grows quietly. It waits. It accumulates. And one day it becomes heavier than fear ever was. That realization, more than anything, motivated him to act. He addressed the idea of respect directly, noting that respect does not mean never challenging one another. Respect means believing a relationship is strong enough to withstand truth. It means trusting that love does not dissolve under honesty. He explained that confronting CeCe publicly was not a sign of diminished respect, but of enduring regard. He would not have spoken if the relationship did not matter. Silence would have been easier. Speaking required faith. He urged the audience to reconsider how they define peace. Peace is not the absence of tension. Peace is the presence of understanding. Sometimes understanding begins with words that feel uncomfortable but necessary. He encouraged families, churches, and communities to stop measuring spiritual maturity by how quiet things remain, and start measuring it by how healthily conflict is handled. He reminded everyone that the Bible is filled with confrontations between people who loved God deeply. Those confrontations did not destroy faith, they refined it. As the moment concluded, there was no applause demanding attention, no declaration of closure. Instead, there was a sense of shared responsibility. Responsibility to resist turning real moments into spectacle. Responsibility to allow families the dignity of complexity. Responsibility to recognize that faith does not erase tension but gives it purpose. Marvin left the stage not as someone who had won an argument, but as someone who had honored the truth. The audience understood that what they had seen was rare, not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. And in a world that often confuses performance for sincerity, that reality carried more power than any rehearsed resolution ever could.